Imagine an island where the sound of ocean waves was once gentle and calm, but in 1945, those same shores echoed with fire, screams, and sorrow. That island was Okinawa, and its story is one of the bloodiest chapters in human history. The Battle of Okinawa was one of the largest and most devastating battles of the Second World War, fought between April and June of 1945. Its scale was massive, involving hundreds of thousands of troops from both the Allied and Japanese forces. The United States, supported by the Allied navies, launched the assault with the goal of capturing the island and using it as a strategic base for further operations against mainland Japan. Okinawa, located just a few hundred miles from Japan's southern islands, was seen as the final stepping stone that could allow a direct invasion of Japan if necessary. Because of its importance, the Japanese were determined to defend it with everything they had. This led to a prolonged and bloody confrontation, unlike many earlier battles in the Pacific that were shorter and less entrenched. The fighting lasted for nearly 3 months, making it one of the longest campaigns of the Pacific theater. Soldiers fought bitterly for every inch of ground, with the Japanese employing a defensive strategy that forced the American troops to advance slowly through heavily fortified positions, caves, and underground tunnels. Unlike previous battles where Japanese forces launched massive assaults early, here they prepared for a long defense, which added to the drawn-out suffering on both sides. Naval battles also raged around the island, with kamikaze pilots inflicting heavy damage on American ships. The sheer length of the battle, combined with the intensity of the resistance, marked it as a turning point in the war. Okinawa became known not only for its scale, but also for the extraordinary destruction it caused, leaving the island scarred and its people devastated. The casualties of the Battle of Okinawa were staggering, making it one of the bloodiest confrontations of the Second World War. More than 200,000 people lost their lives during the campaign, a number that shows not only the ferocity of the fighting, but also the tragic toll it took on civilians as well as soldiers. Among the dead were approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers, many of whom died in combat or through suicide rather than surrender. The United States and Allied forces also suffered greatly, with more than 12,000 troops killed and over 50,000 wounded. Yet, it was the civilian population of Okinawa that bore the heaviest suffering. Roughly 1/3 of the island's inhabitants perished during the battle, caught between the invading armies and the defending forces. Families were torn apart as bombings, artillery shelling, and close-quarter combat devastated towns and villages. Some civilians were killed directly by military action, while others were forced by the Japanese military to commit mass suicides under the belief that capture by American forces would bring dishonor or worse. The tragic scale of death turned the island into a graveyard, where soldiers and civilians lay side by side. Beyond those killed, countless others were left homeless, injured, or traumatized, facing starvation and disease as the fighting consumed their land. The sheer number of lives lost highlights the extraordinary brutality of the battle and why it is remembered as one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War. Every statistic represents real human beings who once had families, dreams, and futures that were forever taken away in the chaos of war. One of the most tragic aspects of the Battle of Okinawa was the suffering of the civilian population. Unlike other battles fought in remote island chains, Okinawa was home to a large community of farmers, fishermen, and families who had lived peacefully for generations. When the battle began, their homes became battlegrounds. The Japanese military often forced civilians to leave their villages and hide in caves or underground shelters, but these places offered little safety. Bombardments, flames, and poison gas sometimes reached inside, turning places of refuge into deadly traps. Thousands of people died while seeking shelter from the violence above. Many civilians were also pressed into service by the Japanese military, given minimal training and crude weapons, and ordered to fight against professional soldiers. Others were used as human shields or forced to carry supplies across dangerous areas. As the fighting grew more desperate, propaganda told civilians that surrendering to American forces would lead to torture or humiliation, and this fear drove some to take their own lives. Whole families jumped from cliffs into the sea, believing it was better to die together than face capture. Children were not spared from this horror, as they too were victims of forced suicides or caught in the bombardments. Fields that once produced food were destroyed, leaving survivors hungry and weak. The island's people lost not only their lives but also their way of life, their villages reduced to rubble and their traditions shattered by war. Civilians had no control over the battle around them, yet they suffered the consequences more deeply than anyone else. Their stories remain some of the most heart-wrenching reminders of how war destroys not only armies but also the innocent. The Battle of Okinawa was not only about immediate survival, but also about its immense military importance in the larger strategy of the Second World War. For the United States and the Allied forces, capturing Okinawa was considered vital because of its location. The island lay just about 350 miles from the southern coast of Japan, making it the perfect staging ground for launching an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Airfields on Okinawa could be used for bombing raids and as supply bases, while its harbors could serve as anchorages for the vast naval fleets needed for such an operation. Military planners saw Okinawa as the last major obstacle standing between the Allies and Japan itself. This is why the United States devoted such massive resources, sending over 180,000 troops supported by a fleet of hundreds of warships. For the Japanese, the island's importance was equally great, but for opposite reasons. If Okinawa fell, it would open the door to the heart of Japan, so they committed nearly their entire defense force to holding it at any cost. The Japanese strategy was not to win in the conventional sense, but to inflict such high casualties on the Americans that they might reconsider invading Japan. This is why the defenders built complex underground tunnels, caves, and fortifications, forcing the battle into a long and exhausting struggle. Every ridge, hill, and cave became a defensive point meant to delay the Allied advance. The scale of planning and the sacrifices made on both sides underline why Okinawa was seen as the last and most decisive battle before the war's end. The island's capture would shape the choices made in the final months of the conflict and influence the course of history itself. One of the most memorable and terrifying features of the Battle of Okinawa was the widespread use of kamikaze attacks by the Japanese military. Kamikaze, meaning divine wind, referred to suicide missions where pilots deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships, aiming to destroy as much as possible while sacrificing their own lives. During the battle, waves of kamikaze pilots launched from mainland Japan and nearby airfields, striking at the Allied naval fleet surrounding Okinawa. More than 1,500 of these attacks took place during the campaign, making it the largest organized use of kamikaze tactics in the war. The American fleet, despite being heavily armed with anti-aircraft defenses, suffered greatly. Dozens of ships were sunk or heavily damaged, and thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. The psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical damage. Sailors lived in constant fear of the sky, knowing that at any moment a plane might dive from the clouds in a fiery explosion. The bravery of the kamikaze pilots was mixed with desperation, for many of them were very young men, often barely trained, and driven by a sense of duty and propaganda that glorified sacrifice over surrender. Some pilots wrote farewell letters to their families before taking off, knowing they would never return. On the receiving end, American sailors faced scenes of horror as ships burst into flames and crewmates were lost in seconds. The sea around Okinawa became a graveyard of wreckage and oil. These suicide missions showed the extreme lengths Japan was willing to go to resist defeat, but they also highlighted the human cost of such tactics. The skies above Okinawa became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, shaping how the battle would be remembered forever. The aftermath of the Battle of Okinawa left scars that extended far beyond the island itself and influenced the closing decisions of the Second World War. When the fighting ended in June 1945, Okinawa was in ruins. Towns and villages had been flattened, fields were scorched, and more than half of the island's population was dead, injured, or displaced. Survivors faced hunger, disease, and the painful task of rebuilding their lives from the ashes. The American forces now controlled a base just a short distance from mainland Japan, but the victory came at such a terrible price that military leaders questioned what an invasion of Japan itself might cost. The scale of destruction on Okinawa offered a grim preview of what a mainland invasion could look like. Millions of deaths on both sides, cities destroyed, and a prolonged conflict. It was this realization that weighed heavily on American decision-makers when considering how to end the war quickly. The memory of Okinawa's carnage was one of the reasons. The atomic bomb was chosen as an alternative to direct invasion. For Japan, the loss of Okinawa was also devastating, as it showed that even the most determined resistance could not stop the Allied advance. The use of kamikaze attacks and mass civilian sacrifices had failed to alter the outcome. For the Okinawan people themselves, the battle left deep cultural wounds. Generations grew up remembering the suffering, the forced suicides, and the devastation of their homeland. Even today, memorials and peace parks on the island honor the countless lives lost, reminding the world of the cost of war. The aftermath of Okinawa was not simply military. It was human, emotional, and lasting, shaping the path to the war's end and the memory of those who endured its horrors. When we look back at the Battle of Okinawa, we see more than a clash of armies. We see lives, hundreds of thousands of them, caught in the storm of war. Soldiers who fought with courage, sailors who faced fire from the skies, families who lost everything, and children who never had the chance to grow old. The island became a symbol of both human strength and human suffering, showing us how high the price of conflict can be. Okinawa reminds us that war is never only about victories or defeats. It is about people. Every number in history was once a living soul with hopes, laughter, and dreams. The tragedy of Okinawa stands as a quiet voice through time, asking us to remember the pain of the past so we can work harder to build a kinder future. If we carry the memory of Okinawa in our hearts, we carry with it a lesson, one that whispers to us about peace, compassion, and the responsibility we share to make choices that preserve life instead of destroying it.